This terrible story began several decades ago in Vancouver. 20-year-old model Dorothy Stratten had it all: youth, beauty, money, success, and a man who loved her. They called her the Canadian Cinderella. Dorothy was predicted to have a great future on stage, but fate had other plans. Dora Hupp, as her full name sounds, was born in February 1960 in a poor area of Vancouver, on the outskirts of the city. Her parents had emigrated to Canada from the Netherlands a year after Dorothy's birth. In the Hope Stratten family, a son, John, was born a year later, and 7 years later, a younger daughter, Louise, was born. The Hope Stratten family lived very modestly. Dorothy excelled in school. She never dreamed of becoming famous. She never thought about a star career. All Dorothy dreamed of as a child were simple things that were beyond the means of her poor family. In 1977, while attending high school, she got a job as a waitress at a local fast food restaurant. Her blonde hair, pretty face, and mature figure for her age instantly drew the attention of patrons. Not only young guys, but also older, wealthy men paid attention to the beauty. One evening, half an hour before the diner where Dorothy worked closed, a charming young man, Paul Snyder, stopped by. He immediately noticed the young girl. When it was time to pay, the man handed her a large bill. The blonde said she couldn't find change for such a bill. Paul smiled and said that the waitress could keep the change, but in return she would have to go out with him. The girl, without hesitation, agreed. 26-year-old Paul Snyder was quite a well-known figure in Vancouver at that time. He worked as a manager for so-called call girls who worked in clubs. The man had many friends and acquaintances in Canada. When Paul first saw 17-year-old Dorothy, a tall blonde with a snow-white smile and a toned figure, he immediately realized that the girl had tremendous potential. Paul invited the beauty on a date to an expensive restaurant. After that, the man bought her a gift, a red evening dress that the girl later wore to her high school prom. Paul and Dorothy began dating. The girl's parents were indifferent to their romance. They did not forbid their daughter to spend time with a man who was 9 years older. After a couple of months of dating, Paul began persuading the blonde to participate in a spicy photo shoot. The girl refused. Paul argued that she had a great chance to become a model and earn big money. Eventually, she agreed to his proposal. Paul rented a studio, hired a professional photographer, and invited the waitress to a photo shoot in the style of New Look. When the pictures were ready, he sent them to the editors of the world-famous men's magazine Playboy. Dorothy's photos caused a sensation. One of the Playboy editors invited the girl to Los Angeles. She understood that her parents would not approve of her working for a spicy magazine. She forged her mother's signature and wrote that she allowed her daughter to sign a contract with the popular glossy publication. In the summer of 1979, Paul and Dorothy flew together from Canada to America to Hollywood. In August, Dorothy Stratten became the Girl of the Month in Playboy magazine. After that, she started working as a bunny at the Playboy Club. On the phone, she confessed to her friends that she was very scared of her new job. She wasn't used to such attention. Rich men went crazy for the model, dreamed of spending time with her, and showered her with compliments. Paul Snider was always by the girl's side and supported her. He began working as her manager and driver, arranging for shoots, signing contracts. The beauty's life was completely under the man's control. To further tie Dorothy to him, Paul proposed marriage. The model was in no hurry to get married, but soon agreed because she felt she simply had to. The blonde understood that if it were not for Paul Snider, she would still be working as a waitress in a diner, content with tips. Her life wouldn't have been like a fairy tale. Dorothy's relatives dissuaded her from marrying Paul. They believed that the husband was using the girl as a toy to shake money out of. In the same year, 1979, Paul and Dorothy got married in Las Vegas. It was a modest wedding without a lavish celebration. The couple continued to work hard. The model participated in the filming of several movies. Directors noted that the girl not only had a beautiful appearance but also a talent for acting. The model's popularity and fees grew. With the money she earned, Dora Stratten bought a large house in Los Angeles where she moved in with her husband. Paul Snider was pleased with his wife. He was proud of her success and told his friends that Dorothy's popularity was their joint achievement. As his wife's manager, Paul was always by her side. He was present at shoots and events, managed money and property, and the man also actively monitored his wife's diet, her outfits, and the amount of alcohol she drank at parties, and sometimes even advised her who she needed to sleep with among influential people to climb the career ladder. There were rumors that Dorothy had an intimate relationship with Hugh Hefner himself, the editor-in-chief of Playboy magazine. However, Hefner himself denied this. Time passed and the model began to understand that her husband, Paul, had too much influence on her life. She hired a new professional manager and stopped taking her husband to shoots, inventing various excuses. The girl distanced herself from her husband, and he, sensing this, began to go crazy. Paul Snider was insanely jealous of his wife. He hired a private detective who followed her every step, but no compromising evidence was found. Dorothy never wore revealing outfits. She didn't want anyone to look at her who didn't present any financial benefit for their family. Paul created scandals and a couple of times in a fit of rage even dared to raise his hand to his wife. The girl could no longer tolerate her husband's tantrums and increasingly distanced herself from him. Friends and colleagues noticed that Paul and Dorothy had serious problems in their family. Playboy employees repeatedly approached the model and persuaded her to break off relations with her husband. Dorothy disappeared on shoots. Paul lived in their house, spent his wife's money, and suffered from idleness. One day, the man learned that his wife had opened a company in her own name and had begun actively investing in it. The girl did this on the advice of her manager. Paul increasingly made scandals about his wife. The man could no longer influence his wife, who hardly appeared at home. Snider realized that his lucky ticket was slipping away from him. In the spring of 1980, at a party in the Playboy mansion, 20-year-old Dorothy was introduced to the famous film director Peter Bogdanovich, a close friend of Hugh Hefner. The director was charmed by the model and invited her to be the heroine of his new comedy called They All Laughed. Dorothy agreed to play the role of a mistress in the film. On March 22, Stratten flew to New York alone for the filming of the comedy. The girl deceived her husband, saying that the director had not allowed anyone on the set except the cast and crew. She persuaded her husband to stay in Los Angeles. The girl was afraid that Paul would start making scandals right during the filming. The blonde also asked her manager to screen calls from her unknowing husband. On the set in New York, Dorothy finally fell in love with Bogdanovich. A whirlwind romance began between the actress and the director. The girl beamed with happiness next to her new man. She didn't want to miss out on a mature, wealthy, and influential director. Dorothy completely cooled down to her husband and distanced herself from him. She spent 2 months in New York. All this time, Paul Snider lived alone in a large house in Los Angeles. He periodically brought women to his place who were very surprised that Paul was cheating on such a beautiful wife, a model of a famous magazine. In April 1980, Dorothy returned to California for the Playboy Awards ceremony. She was named Playmate of the Year by the magazine and made the cover, winning a new title. The model received an expensive gift from Playboy, a sports car, the Jaguar, as well as a cash reward of $200,000. She was close friends with Hugh Hefner. The editor-in-chief had high hopes for the new star. After the ceremony, Dorothy went on a 2-week promotional tour of Canada. On weekends, she flew to see director Peter Bogdanovich. The model planned to spend the last few days of the tour with her parents in Vancouver. Paul Snider learned about this and flew to Canada on the first flight. Remember that he had previously worked as a manager in a nightclub and had many acquaintances in Vancouver. During his wife's short vacation, Paul forced her to work in clubs. The man took all the money for himself. It is known that a major argument occurred between the couple at that time, during which Dorothy burst into tears and offered her husband to end her career to save their marriage. She suggested that Paul return to her parents with her and start life anew. Snider refused. After the tour of Canada, Dorothy returned to New York and continued filming the comedy They All Loved. She ignored her husband's calls and again distanced herself from him. One day, the girl called Paul herself and asked him to give her more freedom in their relationship. Snider was depressed and very angry at his wife. It is known that at that time, Paul Snider was in a relationship with a young girl who was not yet 18 years old. She had a model-like appearance, and Paul wanted to make her a new bunny for Playboy magazine. But he soon realized that the young mistress would never be able to overshadow his wife. In June 1980, on their first wedding anniversary, Paul received a letter from his wife. In it, Dorothy wrote that she wanted to divorce him. She stated that she would no longer help him financially. Paul's fears were confirmed. Now he was sure that his wife was cheating on him with director Peter Bogdanovich. Snider hired a private detective to gather evidence of his wife's infidelity. One day, Paul called his wife's manager and threatened that he would come and make a scandal or maybe something worse. The manager advised Dorothy to hire a bodyguard and be wary of her jealous husband, but the model ignored this warning. As a foreign citizen living in America without a green card, Paul could not get a job. The man was running out of money. Therefore, he began to empty their joint bank accounts with his wife. He sold her valuables, including figurines, jewelry, and even the Jaguar sports car that the model received as a gift from Playboy magazine. Paul sold all these things at huge discounts and took only cash payment. In addition, the man rented out several rooms in their huge house to his girlfriends. He did this partly because he began to suffer from depression and loneliness. Paul began to think that it was time for him to leave this foreign country and return to his native Canada. In mid-July, the filming of the comedy They All Loved was completed. After that, Dorothy and Bogdanovich went on a 10-day vacation to England. On July 30, they returned together to Los Angeles. Dorothy moved into the director's mansion in Bel Air. On the night of July 31, Paul Snider borrowed a gun from a friend. Late in the evening, he went to Peter Bogdanovich's house, armed. Paul hid nearby. The man decided that he would shoot anyone who appeared in the mansion's gate. Paul stayed there for several hours, and then his patience ran out. He got in his car and drove to the mountains, from where there was a beautiful view of nighttime Los Angeles. Later, the man confessed to his friend that he had terrible thoughts of taking his own life. Late in the evening, Snider returned home. The next day, he returned the gun to his friend. A week passed. On August 8, Paul persuaded Dorothy to meet him at their house. The man thought that he could reconcile with his wife, charm her like he did back in the diner on their first meeting. But she was no longer a silly schoolgirl. Standing before Paul was a self-confident girl who no longer wanted to believe her husband's words. Dorothy confessed to Paul that she loved another man and wanted to divorce. Snider restrained himself and asked his wife to come to him in a week and calmly discuss the details of the divorce. The very next day, Paul Snider actively searched for where to buy a gun. He went around shops, but no one wanted to sell a weapon to the man because of his Canadian citizenship. It is known that Snider asked his private detective to buy an automatic weapon, claiming that he wanted to protect himself and his house from robbers. But the detective talked Paul out of it and refused to purchase the weapon. On August 11, Snider found an ad in the newspaper. A hunter was selling his old 12-gauge shotgun. Paul went to Valley Glen to look at the weapon, assess it, and possibly buy it. Along the way, the man got lost, couldn't find the right address, and was forced to return home empty-handed. 2 days later, on August 13, Paul went to the same address again. This time, he found the seller and bought his old shotgun. Snider told the seller that he was going hunting. On August 14, before meeting his wife, Paul Snider asked the neighbors to whom he had rented out rooms to leave the house before evening so they wouldn't interfere with his conversation with his wife. Dorothy's managers and assistants insisted that they go to the meeting with her or discuss all the details of the divorce by phone, but the blonde refused and went alone. The model took a large sum of money with her to generously thank her husband because he had done so much for her. The girl wanted to amicably separate from her husband and remain friends with him. She thought that the meeting with Paul would take a couple of hours, so she had a photo shoot scheduled for that evening. On August 14, at noon, Dorothy arrived at her house to meet with Paul Snider. The man opened the door for her, politely invited her to enter the house. 5 minutes later, the girl's phone rang. It was a call from her manager. They had previously agreed on the call for security purposes. They had agreed that in case of trouble, the girl would tell the manager a code word. Dorothy replied that everything was fine and hung up. She continued talking to Paul. At some point, a misunderstanding arose between the couple. The spouses began to argue, scandalize. Paul Snider abruptly pulled out a shotgun and shot the model right in the face. She died instantly. It is known that immediately after that, Paul had sexual intercourse with his wife and then shot himself. At 8 p.m., the neighbors returned home. They saw Stratten's car outside. Inside the house, in the living room, lay the model's handbag. The neighbors thought that Paul had reconciled with his wife and had retired to the bedroom with her. The neighbors went into their room, turned on the TV, and tried to be quiet so as not to disturb the owners. At the same time, the managers began to worry that the model had stopped answering their calls. At 11 p.m., the managers managed to get through to Paul and Dorothy's house. The neighbors answered the phone. Then they went to the owner's bedroom and saw a terrible sight. Both Dorothy and Paul were dead. The coroner determined that Dorothy died an hour after arriving at the house. Paul Snider died an hour after his wife's death. One of the first people to learn of the tragedy was Hugh Hefner. He was the one who called his friend Peter Bogdanovich and reported the terrible news. Upon learning the Dorothy's death, Bogdanovich lost consciousness and then took sedatives for a long time. The issue of Playboy magazine had already been sent to print. The editors didn't have time to replace the cover. It already featured the deceased beauty, Dora Stratten. However, in the annual Playboy calendar, her image was replaced with a photo of another model. Hugh Hefner commented on the incident. There is this stereotype that a poor girl from a small town gets on the pages of the magazine, moves to Hollywood, builds a dizzying career, and then dies in her prime. But that's not always the case. Paul Snider was a sick jerk who realized that his lucky ticket was slipping away from him. That's what made him commit this terrible act. Peter Bogdanovich organized and paid for Dorothy Stratten's funeral. The man was deeply saddened by the loss of his beloved woman. He cremated her body and buried the remains on a cemetery in Los Angeles. After the model's death, the film studio refused to release the film They All Loved. Peter Bogdanovich bought the film for his own money so that viewers could see his work. The comedy They All Loved was released in 1981. It did not win any major awards. The audience was indifferent to the film. Peter Bogdanovich lost millions and was forced to declare bankruptcy. Over time, rumors appeared in the media that director Bogdanovich was dating Dorothy's younger sister, Lois Stratton, who was only 13 years old at the time. The Stratton parents denied this information and even filed lawsuits against those who spread these nasty rumors. However, 8 years later, in 1988, Bogdanovich married Lois Stratton. The girl was 20 years old at the time. In an interview, Lois said that their romance with the director began when she was 18. Peter and Lois's marriage lasted 13 years. In 2001, the couple divorced. Peter never married again and dedicated his life to work. He died in 2022 at the age of 82. Lois Stratton currently lives in her native Vancouver. She is a Canadian actress and producer. Over 40 years after Dorothy Stratton's murder, numerous films, books, and songs have been released in her memory. One of the most recent works that mentioned the model was the crime drama Welcome to Chippendales. This miniseries tells the story of the legendary male dance troupe Chippendales, whose founder was Paul Snider. The role of Dorothy Stratten in the series was played by Victoria Beckham's daughter-in-law, Nicola Peltz. Our video has come to an end. If you want to see more interesting content, subscribe to our channel and press the bell to not miss the new release.